Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our deep dive into HAProxy logging webinar. We're happy for everyone who was able to join us today. Presenting is going to be Chad Lavoie, who is our Director of Support. Today's topic is all about logging with HAProxy. During the presentation, if you have a question, please enter it into the questions window, and we will do our best to answer it during the Q&A session at the end. We will be making a recording, which we'll make available afterwards. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Chad.
Greetings. So, logging in HAProxy is something probably everybody has seen at one point or another if you've done any work with HAProxy, but there's quite a bit of detail in HAProxy logs. So, first I'm going to go over some of the basic components of a log and what's in it. We're going to go into more detail about the specific contents later, but you essentially have either an HTTP log format or TCP log format, which we'll cover next. In these, you have the HAProxy process and PID. If you're having reload issues or something of that nature, checking the PID to see which process is answering a given request is useful. Otherwise, that is generally ignored. And then you have the client IP address and client port, pretty much what you would expect, the time that the request came in, the the front end and back end name, which we're going to get to next, a bunch of information on the timing of the request, of which we will go over each of these fields in more detail after that. The status code, which is pretty much what you would expect. This is filled in regardless of whether it's HAProxy generating the status or whether it's the backend. You can tell which of those cases it is based upon the termination state, which we will get to after the timing, and the response size. These are cookie captures if you're doing capture request or response cookies. Generally, in most cases, blank unless you're doing that. Information on the backend headers, which we will, or the backend server counts, front end server counts, which we will get to after the termination state. The queue sizes, both of these fields useful for examining what has happened. If you're looking at logs from an event that has happened, you can see what the status was at that time, how loaded things were, that type of thing. You have header captures, both request and response headers. In this case, we're capturing the host header of the request, but this is not to be confused with the cookie captures, so make sure that if you're examining the right field, if you're doing captures, most likely they will format the header captures, even if they're not. And then you have the method, page requested, protocol, pretty much what you would expect. Next, we have the TCP log format. It looks very, very similar to the HTTP log format, except it has many fewer fields because HAProxy is not paying attention to what the client or server is specifically saying. There's not nearly as much information available, but it still will tell you which side ended up closing the connection, who the client was, which back end, front end was used, that type of thing. So, this is relatively self-explanatory, but I want to give a special note to it because it is relatively important. In the logs we have the front end name, so the name that of the front end which the request came into, and the name of the back end and the name of the server in the back end that was selected. This is useful for your obvious sorting and checking uses, but there are a couple of notable conditions which, when debugging, are important. If the front-end name is the same as the back-end name, and the server name is noserve, which will be in brackets, then you know that the request never left the front end. If the backend name is set, but there's no serve here, then you know that the request got into the backend and died in the backend, generally because there was no backend available, but could also be because of rules. You can determine all of these, which of those sub cases happen depending on the termination state, which we will cover in more detail in a second. A lot of times for these rules are often only important if you're writing rules in your front ends, especially when you're doing used backend rules, and you write your used backend rules and the request 503s, and it's not immediately clear why. Looking at the logs and seeing if the request actually got to the backend or if it never left the backend is quite important in cases like that. So now my favorite field in the HAProxy logs, because it tells you exactly what HAProxy was thinking at the end of a connection. You probably cannot read all of the various codes here, which is perfectly fine. They are all in the documentation. If you search for the documentation for state at disconnection, you'll be brought right to that section. Basically, this is for TCP mode. This is a 2-character string, and for HTTP mode, it is 4 characters, which tell you exactly what the state was at the end of the connection, with each letter having a different particular meaning. So the first letter tells you which side ended the connection. So it says if the client closed the connection, if the server closed the connection, if HAProxy timed the connection out while waiting for the client to say something, if HAProxy timed it out while waiting for the server to say something, or whether the proxy closed the connection because of a rule of some sort. In TCP mode, you will still see the same codes, but because HAProxy does not know who is supposed to be speaking, it does not necessarily indicate a problem. In HTTP mode, if the connection closed normally, in other words, the request and response cycle completed as expected, the termination state, the first character will be a hyphen to indicate that the connection was terminated normally. And if it is a hyphen, then the status code that is displayed in the log file, you know that is from the backend server. Even so, if the backend returns a 503 to HAProxy, which returns it to the client, then you would have a hyphen in the termination state field, so you know that HAProxy didn't generate it. The second letter tells you the connection phase at the end of the connection. So what phase it ended in. You can see if it was waiting to get if HAProxy was trying to get the request from the client, if HAProxy was trying to establish TCP connection to the backend server, if it was waiting for headers, or if it was transferring the body of the request. In TCP mode, you're not going to have most of these. You're pretty much just going to see C when it's connecting to the backend server, or D for bodies, because it does not know when it does not try to get a request, nor does it wait for headers. So, but in HTTP mode, this is much more useful. And again, if they're in HTTP mode, if the request completes normally, it will be a hyphen instead of a letter. For both of these, there are a lot more letters that can possibly be used. These are just the common ones that I wanted to highlight specifically. There are actually a whole bunch of letters that for all sorts of edge cases. So if you see a different set of letters, the documentation will explain exactly what they mean. And then the last 2 letters are a little bit different from the first 2, and they cover the persistence cookie state. So if you're using the cookie argument in the backend to handle persistence. The first one is the request is the cookie from the client to HAProxy. So it'll tell you if it got a cookie and if the cookie was valid, or if the server was down. And then the last letter is for what HAProxy was doing regarding sending a cookie from the injecting a cookie from the response from the backend when it was traveling to the client. useful for debugging why persistence is or is not doing what is expected, and also additionally very useful if you're looking at the stats page and you see the LB tote value, which covers the number of requests that were assigned based upon the load balancing algorithm versus persistence is especially low. You can look at the logs, see what clients are providing persistence, and set expire times or something as needed to tighten the persistence up. So for all of these, usually the first thing I do when I get any log sample is cat the log file, awk out the termination state field, and then sort unique sort-n, so you get a nice summary of all the termination states, and then grep out the termination state that I'm particularly interested in. Next, we have the timing fields. There are a whole bunch of timing fields that tells you basically every phase that was in the termination state also has a timer associated with it. So you can see exactly how long each part of the request took. There are a couple of notable fields that are available but are not in the default HTTP log format, and we'll get into covering how to customize the log format a little bit later. The TH field is for the handshake, so you can log how long the SSL handshake or proxy protocol, if using it, handshake took into the logs, and you have TI for the idle time before the request was started, which is much less useful than TH, but is very useful if you are trying to debug a problem involving predictive connections from browsers, and you want to see if a given connection was predictive or made immediately for a given request, but generally not all that relevant outside of that. Then you have a bunch of connection count fields in the logs. It shows you the number of active connections in the process, the connections to the front end, the connections to the back end, the connections to the specific server, and the number of retries. The most common fields in here that I look at are if I'm looking at a log that has, from a time where there were problems. One of the first things I'm going to do after looking at the termination state, if they look relatively normal, would be to look at ActCon to see if ActCon and FECon to see if they are approaching the MaxCon settings of HAProxy. Because if they are, then the connections can end up in the SYN queue of the kernel instead of HAProxy, because HAProxy would not accept the connections yet. So that indicates a problem, and it indicates something that the logs might not otherwise show. Otherwise, obviously, the looking at how many connections there were to the back end to associate with problems with too many connections to a given server, that type of thing. Retries is only set if you have a retry setting, usually in the default section. So it'll retry the TCP connection to the back end if it fails. Very useful if you're, again, having problems, and if I see a lot of plus signs prefixing this number, then I know that it's option redispatch is triggering and it's connecting to a different backend, which is important for both persistence and for knowing that perhaps the health check intervals need to be tightened a bit to make them fail out a server faster, or that there are general network problems at play. So next we will get into the configuration of individual logs. I'm not going to go into extreme detail here because a lot of this is stuff you end up looking up in the documentation later anyway, and it is more important to focus on the bigger picture, but there are a few important notes to be made in this regard. The first is the log statement. You will almost always see one of these in the global section of every HAProxy configuration. It can also be placed in front ends in order to send logs only from that front end to a particular syslog server. It either has an IP address and port or a socket, and the syslog facility to use, and the minimum level that will be sent to that log. So info will send access logs. You can have a separate one set to notice, for example, so one of them only gets more important messages, and access logs will get sent to a specific facility. You don't have to, or specific syslog host, depending on what you're doing. In the global, the one in the global section will be used for all configuration warnings and errors. If you don't have a log section in the global section, you are going to lose out on a lot of global configuration messages, even if you don't want access logs at all. If you put log global in the default section, which is what 90% of configurations do, then any front end or back front end which is associated with which gets the log global will use the global setting in order to send syslogs. So you only need to specify the syslog server once. You can have multiple log instructions for a given front end, so you can have a global log setting and then put an additional logs server for a particular front end, so you can have multiple copies of logs going to different places if so desired. And then you have the minimum level. There is also a second column, which is the maximum level, which is useful pretty much only if you have rsyslog configured to output critical messages or to the terminal, and you do not want back-end and going down notifications to appear on everybody's terminals. You can put a maximum level which will squash the those messages down to the specified level. The notable values that I use all the time for this are info if I want access logs to be enabled, or notice if I just want to see error messages and connection failures and that kind of thing, and I do not want access logs in general. If you are using HAProxy 1.9, you can use std out or std err in order to output the logs directly to standard out or standard error. Pretty much what you would expect, useful if you're putting HAProxy inside of a Docker container. For rsyslog, there are a lot of different ways to configure it. Normally what I do is just have it listen on the IPN port. You can, and then split it out to the various log files. By doing it this way, you can have multiple ports, so you can split them out that way, or you can split them based on facility, or you could split them based upon a column from the log itself for front-end name, for example. Lots of different ways to do it, and it gets rather complicated. If anything is not working, the first thing I do is always just restart rsyslog, because that works far, far more often than I would ever expect it to. Notably because a lot of log rotations will rotate the log files and not notify rsyslog properly, so it won't reopen the log files, and so logs start getting thrown away, and restarting rsyslog, it fixes it. Or the configuration file to place HAProxy logs was put into place, but rsyslog wasn't restarted, so it did not take effect, or all sorts of other things that are fixed by restarting rsyslog. If you end up getting too many files, which, given that there are a lot of ways to deal with them in bulk, requires quite a lot of log entries, you can use the elk stack, where you put the logs into Elasticsearch and then view them with Kibana to make it a little bit easier, but in general, that is not required. If you have problems with log volume, you can do quite a number of things in order to reduce or make more sense of the logs. You have the option of adding don't log normal to, if you input that option in a front end, then requests that terminate normally, in other words, ones with hyphens for the first two characters of their termination state, will not be logged. You can set a conditional to only log based on a condition. In this case, a random number, only logging if a random number is less than 5, to log 5% of the requests to the log, so you can get a log sample without having logs for every single request, which can be combined with other conditionals. So for example, you could tell it to always log requests from logged in users or something else with additional ands or ors onto this ACL. If you start getting into ACLs, we do have an ACL webinar and an ACL blog post, both of which are very good targets for learning more about ACLs and conditions. If you're storing them, logs compress very, very effectively. So if you configure log rotate to gzip the logs, you can store an incredibly amazing amount of log volume and a very small amount of disk space, because there's a lot of repetition in logs. Logs are sent over UDP, so even if the logs service gets overloaded, HAProxy will keep sending out the UDP packets and will not slow itself down while doing so. So that is not a particular concern unless you have rsyslog fighting with HAProxy for a CPU core or something like that, which is generally avoided by CPU map. So now we'll get into log format, which is continuing largely with configuration, but is substantially more advanced. You can find the a log format statement in either the defaults or front-end sections. Normally, in most configurations, you will not see the log format directive anywhere. You will simply see option HTTP log for HTTP or option TCP log for TCP, which sets the log format. For getting started with setting a custom log format, the first thing that I usually do is I go in the documentation in section 8.2, and I look at it. Has the copy and pastable log format line values that both HTTP log and TCP log use. So I just copy and paste one of them into my configuration for the log format, and I start customizing from there. All of the various options that you can use are in the documentation. There is a huge list of various fields that you can choose to add, which are not in the default logs. And additionally, you can use arbitrary fetches. In using SRC in this case would log the source IP address, which is done by any fetch can be used. You just put it in those in brackets starting with $, and you can log almost anything. There's no reason to log SRC, but it is useful if you're doing rate limiting, for example, and you want to log the rate limit. If you want to log the TLS version and you do not want to use a header capture, if you have some part of the body, or even in TCP mode, some part of the body, and you want to capture it, you can do that this way, that type of thing. In a lot of cases, you do want to end up using captures because the logging is done at a later stage of the request processing, so some information is not available. If you do try to add a fetch, which is not available at log time, HAProxy will output a warning when it is parsing the configuration, and the fetch will end up being blank in the logs. In that particular case, if that happens, you'd either look to using captures to assign memory for that, or you can use variables in order to put the information into a variable at the request time so that it stays in memory until the log time where it can be put into the logs. There are log format rules parsed for a number of actions. You have use backend, set map, etc., which allow you to put log fields starting as the same as you do in logs, just starting with a % sign and the field in question. Notably, you can do percent open brace and then put a fetch. So you can put fetches, you can use backend and then put a fetch to automatically select the backend based on the request header, host header, or something of that nature. So there are a lot of cases you'll run into that if you do want to get into using all the log format rules and fetches. Our ACL webinar or ACL blog post is a very good place to start to get started with that, because it's a topic all of its own. You can change the log format to look pretty much however you want, including rewriting it so it outputs in a JSON format, which you can then output to a script, which will one way to get you started to inputting data into Elasticsearch, for example. You can add pretty much any field you want, which is useful if, for example, you wish to log the country code and using the Enterprise Edition Maxmind module or Digital Element modules. You can use one of the respective databases in order to look up the country code and then get a quick summary of which country codes have accessed your page over a given time range. That's one of many different things you might want to do, and if you're trying to debug something and you keep thinking, if only I had this piece of information, it is a good idea to try adding a quick capture in order to capture said piece of information. Although you do want to make sure eventually that if you don't need this information, you remove the captures. Otherwise, the logs can get rather complicated with all of the captures you end up with in there. So now that we've talked a lot about debugging, or now that we've talked a lot about what's in the logs and how to configure them, let's talk about how to use these logs in order to actually debug what is inside of what is actually going on. The first tool that I'm going to talk about here is HAlog. This is a tool that is included with just about all HAProxy distributions, including HAProxy Enterprise, and it is found in the bin folder along with HAProxy itself. And it is capable of parsing HAProxy logs and summarizing them. You can, for example, tell it to give you a summary based upon path, such as what has been seen here. So you can see the number of requests, number of errors, average response time based upon paths. You can also use HAlog-TC to get a summary of termination states, which is useful for then grepping out particular termination states from the logs in order to see exactly what the termination state or why they are what they are. You can use the time argument in order to give HAlog a time range to extract from. So if you know you had a problem somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, you use -time to specify that time range, so that you can only look at logs from that particular window, even if you are doing the usual logging, one log file over every 24 hours. There are a lot of other options for HAlog, and if you run HAlog-H, you will get a full list of all its various arguments. It takes a little while to get used to how to read the help output. However, once you've gotten used to it and played with it a couple of times, it very quickly starts making sense and is pretty easy to work on. If you are using default log formats or mostly default log formats with perhaps a few captures or that type of thing, this HAlog will work fine. Though if you are using a completely custom log format, you won't be able to do that. But if you are using a completely custom log format, I usually find that cat, awk, unique, sort, etc. do a fine job, and it is not uncommon for me to simply cat a log file, walk out the termination state field, sort, unique, sort-c, so I get a list of termination states by the number of requests that triggered them or that type of thing. though you can't use time to get a time range. Obviously, if you're using that type of thing because it doesn't understand the time range, you can still grep for the start, and you can get to the close 10-minute window or that type of thing, which is usually good enough. If you're using HAProxy 1.9, it adds profiling support, which you generally don't want to have enabled all the time because it will add additional load recording all this information. But so to the global section, you can add profiling.tasks on to start profiling. And then you can add additional fields to the log format, which has information like CPU calls, the total number of nanoseconds that was spent in CPU time for the request, the the number of nanoseconds that it took to actually for the complete request processing, that type of thing. It's very useful if you're considering adding a new map or something of that nature and you want to see exactly how difficult that is. It's usually not. Generally, what I find is that most things are not nearly as difficult for HAProxy as they sound. So unless you're using regexes, generally you can do it without worrying about it. But if you wish to worry about it, or if you have a problem with something, then profiling makes figuring out exactly how long a given thing takes a lot easier than going with your usual benchmarking and relying on making a lot of different requests to see how long it took. So the ELK stack, if you, for enterprise customers, we have a guide configuring the HAProxy to output logs to the ELK stack. I'm setting up a basic ELK stack where you have HAProxy output logs to Elasticsearch, which then indexes them and then provides them to Kibana in order to provide provide charts and search and sort based upon the indexed fields. This is quite useful if you have a very complex setup and especially if you've tried something like InfluxDB to Grafana to log your stats, and you find that the stats just don't give you the level of granular detail that you need. And this, you can go even further, so you can get more granular information versus just statistics. Though I would say in 99% of cases, it is easier to either rely on the real-time dashboard for stats, or if you need to go further than that, you set up InfluxDB to Grafana to provide graphing of your statistics at all times. And that generally covers all the requirements I usually run into. But especially in cases where I have to do a lot of deep diving into the actual requests, or if I'm working on things like adding fingerprinting to the logs, and I want to be able to look at the log, I want to be able to examine the logs in bulk to see which fingerprints are triggering under which conditions and that kind of thing. Then having something more complicated than simple logs where stats are simply not enough is very, very helpful. So with that all completed, I think we are at the point where I can answer some questions, if there are any around.
Okay, so thank you, Chad. We do have some questions. First of all, I want to say that this webinar is being recorded, and we will be giving that out shortly afterwards. So if you missed any section of this, if you came in late, don't worry. We're going to be making it available soon. So we have a couple of questions. The first one is, so if we're moving to HTTP2 via HAProxy 1.8, are logs a good way of measuring if this is going to improve the response time from the client to the front end? Would this be a good? Would logs be a good tool for that?
They will, to an extent. Notably, I mean, in HTTP2, what you're going to end up seeing is things like, or what you're generally going to be looking for is conditions like including multiple resources in a single response, which although that you won't get that until you put HAProxy to your HTTP2 to your backends in 1.9, but logs can work to see exactly how much performance you're gaining, though it's going to be hard to see exactly what HTTP2 is responsible for and what simply happened otherwise. So probably benchmarking is an easier way to see exactly how long it's taking, or obviously you could take a TCP log sample and try to compare individual requests. It's there are no really good the thing is, HTTP2 really doesn't change things all that shockingly much, so using the total time field, I suspect, would get bogged down in noise unless you had a very consistent request flow.
Okay, so another question. With the HAProxy logs, are you able to capture the payload of a request or a response?
Yes. So for payload, there are two different ways to interpret that. If you're talking about the HTTP post body of a request, there is the I believe it's req.body fetch, which will fetch that out. You have to add option HTTP buffer request in order for HAProxy to capture it, and then you can add that to the logs, or you can convert that to take a portion of it, convert it to base64, and add that to the logs, that type of thing to capture that. If you're talking about TCP mode, you can capture the for the payload, the first part of the request, of the first packets from the client to the backend could be analyzed via inspect delay and then captured to the logs. Though for any type of capturing in TCP mode, you will have to customize the log format, since the default TCP log format does not include any capture spaces.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Sorry, we have another question. Is there a standard setting for how to format the logs as JSON, and especially taking into account escaping and quoting strings?
There is not a standard there's no standard format for escaping into JSON. There are a couple of tools there are a couple of fetches for assisting in JSON quoting, so that is a little bit easier, but there is no standard log format string to output the logs in JSON, though. There are a few forum posts and that type of thing where people have posted log formats that can do that.
All right. So we have another question. It says, one of our clients has asked if HAProxy can handle client certificates on a non-HTTPS TCP socket.
Yes. So if HAProxy is not terminating SSL, then obviously client certificates are not relevant either way, and HAProxy will just pass them through. But you can terminate TLS even on TCP if you even if you're not using for non-HTTP traffic. Depending on the protocol, this is easier or harder. If you're doing things like or if you're doing the SSL TLS ports for mail or that type of thing, it works without any finagling at all. You can terminate SSL for protocols like Postgres, where there's a couple of characters before the SSL term TLS negotiation occurs via using Lua scripts to handle those first few characters. But regardless of that, in either case, you can add the verify required or verify optional keywords and the CA file keywords to the bind line to verify the SSL certs and either kill the connection if the client cert fails, or you can use ACLs in order to make decisions based upon the validity of the client cert as normal, or just add, obviously you can capture all this to the logs and you can add the status of the client cert to the logs, though if you are using verify required and killing the connection, as soon as the request, if the client cert is not valid, you will not get a log entry at all, and you'll simply see an SSL handshake negotiation failure message instead.
Great. Okay, so we don't have any other questions unless anyone else has anything else that they want to know. 1 second. Looks like we have some more questions. Okay, so when a client is using HTTPS, is it possible to capture the URL in the logs?
Yes, if you're terminating HTTPS in HAProxy using the CRT SSL keywords on the bind line, and then the URL is captured exactly the same as if there was no encryption at all. You can use option HTTP log with HTTPS while you're terminating it, no problems at all. If you are not terminating SSL at HAProxy and doing pass-through, where the backend is negotiating directly with the client, then you cannot see the path at all in HAProxy because it's encrypted when it passes through using keys HAProxy does not have. However, if you wanted to capture the SNI field, or the server name indication, where the client sends the host header for the server to detect to determine which certificate to return, and that's in plain text. And there is a capture for that. So if you're in TCP mode and it's just passing through HAProxy, you can add a field where you log the SNI header regardless of termination.
All right, so another question. They say this person says that they're using the Aloha virtual appliance. Is there a way to add a tool like FileBeat to send logs to the Elk stack?
There is no way to run any tools easily on the Aloha. I would very much like that if that were added. Unfortunately, that is not on the immediate term roadmap, but for the Elk, so for that, what you would have to do is you can either configure HAProxy to send out logs to a external syslog server using the log commands on the layer 7 tab, the same as you would do for a plain old HAProxy. Or if you go to the system tab, you can configure syslog there in order to send the logs, which the internal our syslog server gets to an external one to handle the capturing on the host that's putting them into Elasticsearch.
Okay, and they had a follow-up that said they were using syslog in between.
Right, which is syslog in between is pretty much what you would what I would expect to be done there, but there's no way to make the Aloha itself output logs to the or directly put logs into Elasticsearch.
Okay, so I think that we're out of questions. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Again, this is going to be recorded. We're going to make it available to everyone. And if you have not checked it, looked at it, check out our Slack. We have a community Slack where you can join in the conversation. It's slack.haproxy.com. We'd really like to see all of you there so that we can get your input and really just get more conversations going about what you're seeing out there with HAProxy, how you're using it, and yeah. So with that, thank you.